Karoline Leavitt had always walked a fine line between fiery rhetoric and outright controversy. But no one could have anticipated the sheer audacity of what would unfold during that fateful panel discussion. Aired live across America, the moment was supposed to be another standard appearance, collision of conservative and progressive values. Aired before a divided but expectant audience. The discussion began as many had before it, with pre-scripted talking points, partisan passion, and the ever-present tension humming beneath every exchange. Jasmine Crockett, armed with her signature intellect and unapologetic fire, sat poised at the other end of the table, ready to tackle yet another barrage of dog whistles and baited questions. For her, this wasn't new. It was routine, even when exhausting. But what no one could foresee was how Karoline's simmering resentment would boil over into one of the most disgraceful verbal attacks seen on live television in years. A moment that would forever stain her political credibility and rally a wave of national reflection and outcry. As Karoline leaned into her commentary about immigration, culture, and American values, her tone began to change. The coded language, something viewers had grown familiar with in political discourse, quickly eroded. When Jasmine dared to interrupt, correcting a blatantly false statistic Karoline had tossed out regarding Black Americans and crime rates, Karoline's composure cracked.
Oh.
Her smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed. And then, with the kind of venom rarely seen in public forums, Karoline uttered the phrase that would silence the entire room. "If you don't like it here, why don't you just go back to Africa?" Time froze. The studio audience fell into stunned silence, gasps rippling through the rows like an unexpected wind. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Her expression said it all. Not shock, not hurt, but a piercing clarity. The hosts fumbled, eyes darting to the control room. Producers scrambled behind the cameras, whispering urgently into headsets. Online, the clip had already begun to circulate, spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, "Go back to Africa" was trending, igniting a storm across social media platforms. For Karoline, it was the beginning of the end. For Jasmine, it was the beginning of something far greater, a reckoning, a reclaiming of dignity in the face of televised racism. And for the American people, watching left, right, and centered, was a wake-up call that forced the nation to re-examine not only its politics, but its soul. Jasmine Crockett sat still for a moment, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, not out of shock, but sheer focus. She had heard that phrase before, countless times, though rarely so publicly or so boldly on a national platform. Just the insult, it was the casual cruelty behind it, the centuries of pain embedded in a sentence so small, yet so deeply loaded. But Jasmine wasn't built to retreat, and certainly not now. She glanced calmly across the table, met Karoline Leavitt's eyes with the kind of unwavering stare that unnerves even the most seasoned opponents, and then leaned forward just slightly, not to raise her voice, but to ensure that her words would slice through the thick fog of silence and hit their mark with surgical precision. "Karoline," she began, her voice even, her tone commanding yet calm. "This is America. I was born here. My ancestors built this country. We bled in the cotton fields, marched in the streets, fought in the wars, and raised generations that made this land what it is. So if anyone's leaving, it won't be me."
Ow.
The audience erupted not in chaos, but in a wave of applause that rose slowly like a growing tide, as though people had been waiting their entire lives to hear someone say exactly that, in exactly that way, in that exact moment.
Ah!
Karoline shifted in her seat, the fire in her eyes replaced by something colder, panic. The producers couldn't cut away. They couldn't mute Jasmine. This wasn't a slip-up that could be buried under a PR statement. This was an unraveling of the manufactured decorum that shielded certain kinds of ugliness in American discourse. Jasmine continued, not backing down for a second. "You say go back to Africa as if being black in this country is foreign. It's your ignorance that's foreign. It's your denial of history that's un-American. My people didn't come here. They were dragged here, and yet we endured. We resisted, and we remained. You don't get to decide who belongs here because we've belonged since before your family even set foot on this soil." The panelists sat frozen. One anchor slowly reached for her coffee, but missed the cup. Another stared at the floor. Karoline tried to interject, but Jasmine cut her off with the kind of authority that silences, not through volume but through righteousness. "You want to talk about patriotism?" Jasmine said. "Where were your words when people stormed the Capitol waving Confederate flags? Where was your outrage when hate groups were marching under torches? You see, you're not angry because I questioned your lies. You're angry because I refused to be silent. Because a black woman standing her ground threatens everything you pretend to defend." That was the moment America changed channels, not from one network to another, but from one era to another. The response online was swift and overwhelming. Celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens flooded Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok with clips, reactions, essays, and testimonies. Hashtags like hashtag IST, and with Jasmine, hashtag not going anywhere, and hashtag go back to history began trending worldwide. Schools replayed the segment in classrooms. News networks looped it every hour. And Karoline, once a rising star of right-wing punditry, found herself at the center of a cultural firestorm she was woefully unequipped to handle. Sponsors began distancing themselves. Bookings were canceled. Even some of her own colleagues hesitated to defend her. But while Karoline scrambled for damage control, Jasmine didn't retreat into silence. She did the opposite. She leaned into the moment, not for clout, not for personal gain, but because she understood that this was bigger than her. This was about generations of pain being seen, heard, and finally answered. In her next appearance on national television, Jasmine doubled down not with anger, but with grace, dignity, and a voice sharpened by purpose, recounted her family's history, her journey through law, public service, the ways in which she had endured subtle and overt racism all her life. And then she reminded America why her presence on that stage mattered so much. Because the very idea that a black woman could not only hold her own in a political debate, but win it, without stooping to hatred, was a revolutionary act in itself. The moment became more than just a viral clip, became a symbol. Jasmine's words were printed on protest signs, engraved into murals, quoted in graduation speeches, and even included in sermons. Young black girls across the country replayed the clip like a mantra, emboldened by her strength. White allies began to speak up more forcefully in their own circles, using the moment as a catalyst to challenge the biases buried in everyday life. And for Karoline, the fallout was immediate and relentless, not just because she had said something racist, but because she had done so with the kind of flippancy that exposed just how normalized those attitudes still were. When confronted with the backlash, she attempted a half-hearted apology, claiming her words were taken out of context and that she had misspoken in the heat of debate. But America wasn't buying it. The context was crystal clear, and the damage irreversible. Yet even as Karoline flailed, Jasmine remained centered, refusing to let the narrative drift away from what mattered most. "This isn't about me versus her," she said in an interview. "This is about a system that has tolerated, excused, and even rewarded this kind of behavior for too long. It's time to change that, not with censorship, but with truth." In that truth, Jasmine had found power in America, for a rare and necessary moment, was finally listening. In the days that followed the explosive exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt, the aftershocks reverberated not only through the media, but through the very heart of the American consciousness. The footage of Jasmine's clapback had now been watched by tens of millions of people, dissected in university lecture halls, discussed in community centers, and referenced in barbershops, churches, and classrooms across the country. It had become more than a viral moment, had become a defining one. But what made it so powerful wasn't just the insult or even the initial response, it was what came next. The unshakable resolve Jasmine carried into each and every appearance after. The unrelenting spotlight she shined not only on Karoline, but on a system that allowed such sentiments to fester, hide behind coded language, and masquerade as patriotism. Jasmine wasn't just clapping back anymore. She was educating, exposing, and awakening people on both sides of the aisle who had grown too comfortable with their indifference. Invitations from major networks poured in. But unlike others who might seize the attention for superficial fame, Jasmine wielded her voice with surgical precision, using each appearance to uplift voices from marginalized communities and bring historical context to the center stage. In one particularly moving segment on a primetime special, Jasmine held up a photograph of her great-grandmother, a woman born into segregation, who lived through Jim Crow, and who had once been told she couldn't vote because of the color of her skin. This woman, Jasmine said, holding the image close to her chest, was told she didn't belong here, that her voice didn't matter, but she stayed. She endured. So when I speak today, I'm speaking with her voice, and the voices of millions whose dignity was stolen, but whose strength never wavered. The audience gave her a standing ovation. It wasn't performative. It was collective catharsis. People began writing in. Letters, emails, voice messages, and open testimonials poured into her congressional office and her public email. Parents of biracial children wrote to thank her for showing their daughters what resilience looked like. Veterans wrote in sharing how they had served alongside black comrades in wars and how they were disgusted to hear someone like Karoline belittle their sacrifices. Even former Karoline supporters, young conservatives disillusioned by her outburst, began to write in, some publicly posting their apologies and pledging to educate themselves more deeply on systemic racism in American history. Knew that speeches and media attention were only one part of the fight. She swiftly organized a town hall not to talk about the insult alone, but to highlight the lived experiences of Black Americans who, like her, had encountered this exact form of veiled and unveiled racism in their workplaces, schools, and public life. She invited scholars, activists, mothers who'd lost sons to police brutality, immigrants who had been told to go back to places they'd never been. What emerged from that town hall wasn't a pity session, it was a call to action. Policies were discussed. Legislation was proposed, an initiative to embed anti-racism education more fully into public schools was drafted and backed by a coalition of bipartisan lawmakers. It was Jasmine once again refusing to let the narrative shrink to a soundbite. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt found herself wading deeper into scandal. Each interview she attempted seemed more rehearsed, more deflective. At one point, she tried to portray herself as a victim of cancel culture, claiming she was being targeted for telling the truth about America, but no one was fooled. She was invited to a conservative summit, where her attendance sparked protests, even from within her own party. Sponsors and donors who had once funded her campaigns quietly pulled out. Her own PR team began to back away. In one leaked internal memo, an advisor reportedly wrote, "Karoline underestimated the strength of her opponent. Crockett didn't just win the argument, she changed the conversation." As Leavitt's influence declined, Jasmine's rose. Not as a media darling, but as a new kind of political leader, one unafraid to confront, unafraid to educate, and unwilling to be silenced. But Jasmine's focus never drifted toward revenge. In an emotional podcast episode, she said, "This isn't about humiliation. This is about transformation. If we can turn even one racist insult into a national awakening, then none of it was wasted, and transform it did." Universities began citing the incident in race and politics curricula. One high school in Chicago named its Black Student Union Room after Jasmine. A mural appeared in Detroit, painted across a brick wall with her words in bright gold. "I'm not going anywhere. We built this." The art became a pilgrimage site for young activists. Tourists snapped selfies with the wall. Local leaders held poetry slams beneath it. It wasn't about celebrity. It was about legacy. Jasmine was becoming more than a congresswoman. She was a symbol. She was living, breathing testimony that dignity in the face of hate was not weakness. It was the most powerful act of defiance. And all of this stemmed from one sentence of vile, ignorant phrase meant to demean that had instead sparked the most potent civic awakening in recent memory. And through it all, Jasmine never spoke Karoline's name again. "I'm not here to elevate my attackers," she said. "I'm here to elevate the truth." In that, she reclaimed the narrative not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong.